In a world where global tensions can shift in an instant, we're witnessing one of the most critical diplomatic moments of our time. President Donald Trump has announced a significant development that could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East and beyond. The United States will suspend bombing and attacks on Iran for 2 weeks, marking a potential turning point in what has been an escalating conflict that has gripped the world's attention. This announcement comes after weeks of intense military operations, diplomatic maneuvering, and threats that have pushed the region to the brink. To understand the full weight of this moment, we need to examine how we arrived here, what this suspension means, and what the future might hold. The conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran has been building for years, but recent events have brought it to a dangerous crescendo. According to multiple international news sources, including Reuters and Bloomberg, the situation escalated dramatically in early 2026 when a series of military strikes began targeting Iranian infrastructure, military installations, and strategic sites across the country. The human cost has been staggering. Preliminary figures from Al Jazeera's live tracker indicate that more than 2,076 people have been killed in Iran, at least 26 in Israel, 13 United States soldiers, and 28 killed in Gulf states. These numbers represent real people, families torn apart, communities devastated, and a region transformed by violence. The trigger for the current crisis can be traced back to Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical waterways. This narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman serves as the primary route for approximately 1/5 of the world's petroleum and a significant portion of liquefied natural gas. When Iran blocked this strategic choke point, it sent shockwaves through global energy markets and threatened the economic stability of nations worldwide. President Trump responded with unprecedented threats. According to multiple credible sources, including the New York Times and Al Jazeera, Trump issued an ultimatum to Iran demanding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. His language escalated to alarming levels, with statements that raised concerns among international law experts and human rights organizations. The president threatened to destroy Iranian infrastructure, including every bridge and power plant in the country, and made statements suggesting devastating attacks on civilian infrastructure. These threats drew immediate condemnation from international bodies. The United Nations, the European Union, and multiple world leaders expressed grave concern about the potential for massive civilian casualties and violations of international humanitarian law. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and other European leaders publicly criticized the approach, while human rights organizations warned that targeting civilian infrastructure would constitute war crimes under international law. The military operations that did occur were extensive. According to United States Central Command press releases, operations designated as Epic Fury involved carrier strike groups, including the USS Abraham Lincoln, conducting sustained military operations. The scale of these operations involved hundreds of sorties, targeting Iranian military installations, Revolutionary Guard facilities, and strategic infrastructure. Israel also participated in these operations, with strikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and command centers. According to Bloomberg and Reuters reporting, Israeli forces conducted precision strikes on multiple Iranian cities, including operations near Tehran that targeted research facilities and military installations. Iran did not remain passive. Iranian forces launched retaliatory strikes against Israeli targets, American bases in the region, and strategic sites in Gulf nations. According to Al Jazeera, Iranian missiles struck locations across Israel, and Iranian-backed forces attacked shipping in remaining open waterways and targeted American military installations in Iraq and other neighboring countries. The economic consequences have been severe and far-reaching. Oil prices surged past $114 per barrel, according to Bloomberg market data, the highest level in over a decade. This spike in energy costs triggered a cascade of economic effects worldwide. Countries dependent on oil imports faced energy crises, forcing emergency conservation measures. Egypt, for example, implemented strict energy rationing, requiring commercial establishments to close by 9 p.m. on most nights, according to Al Jazeera reporting. India faced severe fuel supply disruptions, with Mumbai's historic Sassoon dock seeing fishing boats sit idle as diesel costs made operations economically unviable. Singapore announced $1 billion in economic support measures and flagged energy supply risks as the conflict disrupted regional trade routes. The humanitarian impact extended far beyond the immediate conflict zones. More than 390 employees of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, were killed during the 2-year Gaza conflict, making it the deadliest conflict for UN personnel in the organization's history, according to statements from the UNRWA head, reported by Reuters. In Gaza, where a fragile ceasefire had been negotiated, the broader regional conflict undermined stability. Israeli airstrikes continued to kill Palestinians, with incidents reported by Reuters showing at least 10 people killed near a Gaza school housing displaced Palestinians in early April 2026, and multiple other strikes killing 6 or more people in separate incidents throughout March and early April. The political developments in Israel added another layer of complexity. Israel's parliament passed controversial legislation making death by hanging a default sentence for Palestinians convicted in military courts of deadly attacks. This law, passed on March 30, 2026, drew immediate international condemnation. The United Nations Human Rights Chief stated the legislation violated international humanitarian law. 8 Muslim-majority countries issued a joint statement strongly condemning the law, and Spain's prime minister labeled it a step toward apartheid. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts were underway behind the scenes. Pakistan emerged as a crucial mediator in the crisis. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif engaged in intensive diplomacy, speaking directly with both American and Iranian officials. According to multiple sources, including Al Jazeera and the New York Times, Pakistan hosted negotiations and worked to find common ground between the opposing parties. China also played a significant role. Iranian officials told the New York Times that China pressed Iran toward accepting a ceasefire, using its economic leverage and strategic partnership to encourage de-escalation. China's involvement reflects the complex web of international relationships at play, with Beijing seeking to protect its economic interests in the region while maintaining its alliance with Tehran. The pressure on Trump came from multiple directions. Within the United States, opposition grew to the escalating conflict. Climate activist Greta Thunberg publicly criticized Trump's threats against Iran, reflecting broader concerns among young Americans who polls show are increasingly skeptical of foreign military interventions. Democratic politicians condemned Trump's rhetoric, with some calling his threats genocidal and demanding accountability. International allies also expressed reservations. The United Kingdom signaled it would not allow the United States to use British bases for strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, according to Bloomberg reporting. This represented a significant diplomatic constraint on American military options and reflected European unease with the trajectory of the conflict. The economic pressures were equally important. American businesses faced mounting costs from surging oil prices. Delta Airlines announced it was increasing checked bag charges by up to $50 due to rising fuel costs, according to Bloomberg. Financial markets experienced significant volatility, with stock prices dropping as the conflict worsened. Companies dependent on stable energy prices and global supply chains pressed for de-escalation. Iran, for its part, presented a 10-point peace proposal. While the full details have not been publicly disclosed, reporting indicates the proposal included provisions for Iranian control over security arrangements in the Strait of Hormuz, guarantees against future attacks on Iranian territory, and frameworks for regional security cooperation. Trump initially dismissed this proposal as not good enough, but it provided a foundation for further negotiations. As Trump's deadline approached, tensions reached a fever pitch. The president had set a specific time frame for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, threatening massive military action if compliance was not forthcoming. His statements, including the alarming declaration that a whole civilization will die tonight, reported by Al Jazeera and other outlets, created a sense of impending catastrophe. Iranians responded with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. Reporting from Tehran showed ordinary citizens expressing shock at the threats while also demonstrating resolve. Iranian officials maintained that the threats were delusional and that Iran would not capitulate to pressure. The Iranian military warned of surprises if Trump carried out his threats, suggesting preparations for significant retaliation. In these final hours before the deadline, Pakistan intensified its mediation efforts. Prime Minister Sharif appealed directly to Trump to extend the deadline, citing progress in diplomatic negotiations and urging that diplomacy be allowed to run its course. According to reports, Vice President J.D. Vance became directly involved in these last-minute negotiations, traveling to meet with Pakistani officials to assess the viability of a diplomatic solution. Then came the breakthrough. President Trump announced that the United States would suspend bombing and attacks on Iran for a period of 2 weeks. This announcement, delivered just as the deadline was approaching, represented a dramatic shift from the rhetoric of the previous days. According to the announcement, Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with safe passage through the waterway to be coordinated with Iranian armed forces. This represented a face-saving compromise for both sides. Iran maintained a role in controlling access to the strait, addressing its security concerns and demonstrating that it had not simply capitulated to American threats. The United States achieved its stated objective of reopening this critical waterway, alleviating the immediate economic crisis caused by its closure. The terms of the suspension are significant. For 2 weeks, American and Israeli military operations against Iranian targets will cease. This creates a window for diplomatic negotiations to address the underlying issues that have fueled the conflict. According to Al Jazeera, Iran announced that formal talks with the United States would begin in Islamabad, Pakistan on Friday, with negotiations to be based on Iran's 10-point proposal. The reaction to this announcement has been mixed. In Tehran, celebrations erupted as news of the ceasefire spread. Al Jazeera reported on crowds gathering in the Iranian capital with people waving flags and expressing relief that the immediate threat of devastating attacks had been averted. The Iranian government characterized the agreement as a victory, crediting national unity and strategic patience for achieving this outcome. In the United States, the political response divided along predictable lines. Republican hawks in Congress expressed skepticism about negotiations with Tehran, questioning whether Iran could be trusted to adhere to any agreement. They argued for maintaining maximum pressure on Iran and expressed concern that the suspension of military operations would allow Iran to regroup and strengthen its defensive capabilities. Democratic politicians generally welcomed the ceasefire while calling for accountability regarding the conduct of the conflict. They raised questions about the legal basis for the military operations, the civilian casualties that resulted, and the threats to destroy civilian infrastructure. Some called for congressional hearings to examine the decision-making process that led to the escalation. International reaction has been cautiously optimistic. European leaders expressed relief at the de-escalation while emphasizing the need for a comprehensive diplomatic solution to address regional tensions. The United Nations called for the ceasefire to be extended and formalized, with Secretary General representatives indicating readiness to facilitate broader regional peace talks. However, significant challenges remain. Russia and China blocked a United Nations Security Council resolution regarding the Strait of Hormuz, with 11 out of 15 members supporting the measure. This veto power exercised by Moscow and Beijing demonstrates that great power competition continues to complicate efforts to establish international consensus on Middle East security issues. The humanitarian situation requires urgent attention. In Gaza, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas remains fragile, with continued violence threatening to unravel the agreement entirely. The World Health Organization suspended medical evacuations from Gaza after a WHO worker was killed, highlighting the ongoing dangers faced by humanitarian personnel. The broader conflict has exacerbated suffering in Gaza, where water shortages and infrastructure damage have created a humanitarian catastrophe. The economic recovery will be complex and potentially lengthy. While the announcement of the ceasefire led to some stabilization in oil markets, prices remain elevated compared to pre-conflict levels. Countries that implemented emergency conservation measures cannot immediately reverse these policies, as energy supplies remain constrained. The shipping industry continues to face disruptions, with insurance costs for vessels transiting the region significantly elevated due to perceived risks. The 2-week time frame creates both opportunities and pressures. Negotiators will need to address fundamental questions about regional security architecture, including the role of external powers in the Persian Gulf, mechanisms for preventing future conflicts, and pathways toward normalizing relations between Iran and its regional adversaries. The negotiations in Islamabad will focus on several key issues. First, the long-term status of the Strait of Hormuz and other critical waterways must be resolved. Iran seeks recognition of its security interests and a role in managing access to these passages, while the international community requires guarantees of free navigation in accordance with international maritime law. Second, the question of sanctions relief will be central to any comprehensive agreement. Iran has long sought the removal of economic sanctions that have severely constrained its economy. The United States has used sanctions as a primary tool for pressuring Iran to change its behavior on multiple fronts, including its nuclear program, ballistic missile development, and support for regional proxy forces. Third, the nuclear issue remains unresolved. Previous agreements limiting Iran's nuclear program have collapsed, and there are concerns about Iran's current capabilities and intentions. Any sustainable peace agreement will need to address international concerns about nuclear proliferation, while recognizing Iran's stated right to peaceful nuclear energy. Fourth, the role of proxy forces and regional conflicts must be addressed. Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and Hamas and other Palestinian groups has been a major source of tension with the United States, Israel, and Gulf nations. These relationships are deeply rooted in Iran's strategic doctrine and will be difficult to resolve through negotiation. The domestic political situations in both the United States and Iran will significantly influence the negotiating dynamics. President Trump faces political pressure from multiple directions. His base expects him to take a tough stance on Iran and may view negotiations as a sign of weakness. However, the economic and political costs of continued military operations create incentives for a diplomatic resolution. In Iran, the government must balance its commitment to resistance against foreign pressure with the very real suffering of the Iranian people. The sanctions, combined with the direct military strikes, have inflicted significant hardship. The Iranian government has portrayed the ceasefire as a victory, but it will need to demonstrate that negotiations produce tangible benefits for ordinary Iranians. The involvement of regional powers will be crucial. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf nations have their own interests in any regional security arrangement. They have been concerned about Iranian military capabilities and regional influence for years, and they will want assurances that any agreement addresses their security concerns. Previous efforts at regional dialogue have foundered on these complex, multi-party dynamics. The humanitarian dimension cannot be overlooked. The conflict has caused immense suffering, and there are urgent needs for reconstruction, medical care, and support for displaced populations. International humanitarian organizations will need access to affected areas, and resources will need to be mobilized for recovery efforts. The long-term trauma experienced by populations that have lived through intense military operations will require sustained attention. The implications for international law and norms are profound. The threats to target civilian infrastructure, if carried out, would have represented serious violations of the laws of war. The fact that such threats were made at the highest levels of government raises troubling questions about the erosion of international legal constraints on warfare. The international community will need to reaffirm these fundamental principles and consider mechanisms for preventing similar threats in the future. The economic interdependence that characterizes our modern world has been both a source of vulnerability and a potential pathway to peace. The disruption to energy markets demonstrated how deeply connected the global economy is, with events in the Persian Gulf immediately affecting prices, policies, and livelihoods thousands of miles away. This interdependence creates powerful incentives for maintaining stability, as all parties ultimately suffer from prolonged conflict. Looking ahead, the 2-week ceasefire period will be critical. Negotiators will work intensively to develop a framework that can be extended and eventually formalized into a lasting agreement. The fact that talks are happening at all represents progress from the brink of catastrophic escalation that seemed imminent just days ago. However, history teaches us to be cautious about celebrating too early. The Middle East has seen numerous ceasefires that ultimately collapsed, numerous peace processes that failed to produce lasting agreements, and numerous moments of hope that gave way to renewed violence. The underlying tensions that have fueled this conflict run deep, rooted in competing visions of regional order, historical grievances, and fundamental disagreements about security and sovereignty. The role of Track 2 diplomacy, involving non-governmental actors, academics, and civil society organizations, may prove important in building trust and exploring creative solutions. Official negotiations often become bogged down in rigid positions and domestic political constraints. Informal dialogues can sometimes find pathways forward that official channels cannot. The media landscape surrounding this conflict has been complex. Different outlets have reported events through various lenses, reflecting different national perspectives and political orientations. Sorting through these multiple narratives to understand what has actually happened requires careful attention to sourcing, verification, and cross-referencing of information. The facts presented in this account have been drawn from multiple credible journalistic sources, including Reuters, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, and official government statements from United States Central Command and other agencies. The technological dimensions of modern warfare have been on full display during this conflict. Precision-guided munitions, satellite surveillance, cyber operations, and advanced air defense systems have all played roles in the military operations. The F-15E aircrew that was successfully rescued, as reported by U.S. Central Command, likely benefited from sophisticated search and rescue technologies, including the Boeing Combat Survivor Evader locator device mentioned in Bloomberg reporting. The conflict has also highlighted the vulnerability of critical infrastructure in an age of precision weaponry. The strikes on bridges, power plants, research facilities, and transportation networks demonstrated that modern militaries can inflict widespread disruption on civilian life without necessarily occupying territory or engaging in traditional ground warfare. This raises new questions about deterrence, defense, and the protection of civilian populations. Climate activists and environmental advocates have pointed to this conflict as another example of the dangers of continued dependence on fossil fuels. The fight over control of oil transit routes represents an old pattern in Middle East conflicts, and some argue that transitioning to renewable energy would reduce the strategic importance of these choke points and decrease the likelihood of such conflicts in the future. The human stories behind the statistics deserve attention. The more than 2,000 people killed in Iran, the 26 killed in Israel, the 13 American soldiers, and the 28 killed in Gulf states all had families, dreams, and futures that have been cut short. The injured number far higher, many facing long recoveries and permanent disabilities. The psychological trauma affecting entire populations, especially children who have lived through terrifying bombardments, will have lasting effects for generations. In Gaza, the coincidence of the broader regional conflict with the fragile ceasefire there has made an already desperate situation even worse. Families still separated from children who were evacuated as premature babies 2 years ago are finally being reunited, as Reuters reported. But the joy of these reunions is tempered by the ongoing violence and uncertainty about the future. The return of soccer tournaments to Gaza, also reported by Reuters, represents a small sign of normalcy, but the landscape of destroyed buildings and ongoing military operations makes any real recovery seem distant. The investigation into the killing of more than 390 UNRWA staff members, as reported by Reuters, represents an important accountability measure. These were humanitarian workers attempting to provide assistance to desperate populations, and their deaths under circumstances that warrant investigation highlight the dangers faced by those trying to help in conflict zones. The passage of the death penalty law for Palestinians in Israeli military courts, which occurred during this period, has been condemned by human rights organizations, the United Nations, and multiple governments as a violation of international law. The European Union called the development very concerning, and the 8 Muslim-majority countries that issued a joint condemnation reflected widespread regional opposition to the measure. As we stand at this juncture, with 2 weeks of suspended military operations ahead, the international community faces a choice. Will this pause be used constructively to build a pathway toward sustainable peace, or will it simply be an interlude before renewed hostilities? The answer will depend on the willingness of all parties to compromise, the skill of diplomats and negotiators, and the pressure that domestic and international constituencies can bring to bear for peaceful resolution. President Trump has described the suspension as a pause, not an end, to military operations. This framing suggests that he views the military option as remaining on the table if negotiations do not produce results he finds acceptable. Iran has similarly indicated that it is prepared to defend itself if attacked again, suggesting that its agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz does not represent a broader capitulation. The path forward will require addressing not just the immediate crisis, but the underlying issues that have made the relationship between Iran and its adversaries so fraught. Decades of mistrust, conflicts fought through proxies, competing alliances with global powers, and fundamental disagreements about regional order cannot be resolved in 2 weeks of negotiations. However, those 2 weeks can potentially establish a foundation for a longer-term diplomatic process. The role of verification and monitoring will be crucial. Any agreement regarding the Strait of Hormuz will need mechanisms to ensure that shipping can transit safely and that all parties adhere to their commitments. This might involve international observers, technological monitoring systems, or agreed-upon protocols for managing the waterway. The economic incentives for peace are substantial. Iran's economy has suffered tremendously under sanctions and military strikes. Reconstruction will require enormous resources, and access to international markets and investment would greatly facilitate recovery. For the Gulf nations, stability in energy markets and shipping routes is essential for their economic models. For the United States and its allies, lower energy costs and reduced military expenditures would both be economically beneficial. The challenge will be structuring an agreement that provides each party with enough of what it needs to justify the compromises required. Iran needs sanctions relief and security guarantees. The United States and its allies need assurances regarding nuclear programs, ballistic missiles, and regional proxy activities. The Gulf nations need protection from threats to their security and economic interests. Finding formulas that address these multiple, sometimes conflicting needs will require creativity and flexibility. As this 2-week period begins, the world watches with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Hope that diplomacy can succeed where military force has only produced more suffering and instability. Apprehension that the forces pulling toward renewed conflict may prove stronger than those pushing toward peace. The stakes could not be higher, not just for the immediate parties to the conflict, but for a global economy and international system deeply affected by events in this volatile region. This moment reminds us that in our interconnected world, distant conflicts are never truly distant. The decisions made in Washington, Tehran, Islamabad, and other capitals in the coming days will affect fuel prices in Mumbai, electricity availability in Cairo, family budgets across Europe and America, and the prospects for peace or continued warfare in one of the world's most strategically important regions. The suspension of bombing and attacks on Iran for 2 weeks represents a significant development, a stepping back from the precipice of what could have been a catastrophic escalation. Whether this pause becomes the beginning of a genuine peace process or merely a temporary lull in hostilities remains to be seen. What is certain is that the coming days will be crucial in determining the trajectory not just of U.S.-Iran relations, but of the broader Middle East and the global order that depends on stability in this critical region.